Our first panelist is, and you can read more about their bios in the booklet sent around, so I'll just keep these pretty brief for now. Our first panelist is DA Scott Colom. DA Colom was elected District Attorney for Circuit Court District 16, which includes Lowndes, Oktibbeha, Clay, and Noxubee counties. He's the first African-American district attorney to represent a majority white district in Mississippi. Our second panelist is Anthony Swift. Mr. Swift created an organization called People for Change in America, which is devoted to seeking justice for people of all races in this country's judicial system. Mr. Swift is the appointed president of the Clay County chapter of the NAACP. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Mr. Colom. Good afternoon, Mr. Swift. So my first question is for DA Colom. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with your community and the ways in which you have managed to build those relationships since taking office in 2015?
Yeah, so happy to be a part of it, happy to be on the panel. Thanks to IIP for inviting me. Thanks to IIP for inviting my friend, and he's on my board of people that have been directly impacted by the system, Anthony Swift, to be a part of the panel. When I got elected in 2015, I started in 2016. I ran on a reform platform that my predecessor had been too tough on crime, had viewed incarceration as much as possible as the primary means of preventing crime and addressing criminal issues. He was particularly harsh, and the laws in Mississippi were particularly harsh when it came around drug crimes at the time. And he took a very tough position on that. And I ran on a reform platform and could talk a lot about what I've done, but to address the issue of building community relations, I think what's important is that the way I see it is there are really two groups of people in the community when it comes to the criminal justice system. You have the vast majority of people which have very, very little impact, right? You know, they're not the victims of crime, they're not committing crimes, they may get summons to serve on a jury or a grand jury, and a lot of those people end up not actually having to serve. So the vast majority of people, other than watching it on television or reading on the news, have very little involvement with our criminal justice system. And then you have a smaller set of people that actually have quite a bit of involvement with our criminal justice system. And that includes our victims. Most of our victims in my area that are victims of crime, they tend to either have a loved one that's been accused of a crime or indicted for a crime or on the docket for a crime, or they themselves have been accused of a crime, been arrested for a crime. They know a lot of people that are dealing with the criminal justice system, or there were what we call people that are kind of in and out of the criminal justice system quite a bit. And so what I learned is really that second group of people is a group of people that you really have to have good relationship with as a district attorney and as a police force, because one, that's where a lot of your witnesses are going to come from. If you don't have good relationship with that group of people, if you don't have credibility with that group of people, it's going to be very difficult for you to prosecute those violent, serious cases where you need witnesses, you need cooperation. And so what I did is I spent a lot of time trying to build relationships within that community of people that are actually getting the vast majority of their crime. I don't want to monopolize too much of the time, but the other point I want to make that I think is very important is you have to listen to the voices of people that have been impacted in the system. I know Anthony, I don't know if he's on the panel yet. We kind of got a little bit of a mix up with the time, Central Time versus Eastern Time. So I hope he'll join us soon and he can tell a bit about his story. But let me tell you how I work with him. Anthony's somebody that at a young age was involved with drug selling. He did several bids in our prison system and got out, and after serving quite a bit of time, decided that obviously wanted to turn his life around, got a job, got married, did all those things that can be difficult for people to do on reentry, but what are necessary for us to actually build a better system. But he didn't stop there, because he realized that what he went through in the system, he realized what needed to be changed in it. And so he's been an advocate with me about trying to reform some of our parole practices when it comes to people that who receive really stiff sentences for drug charges. In Mississippi, back in prior to 2015, what could happen is on a third offense of a nonviolent offense, if like, for example, if you had a third offense of sale of cocaine, small amount, if that was your third offense and you were found guilty of it, you could get up to 60 years mandatory in prison. And so what you had is people that got sentences that, I think, well, at least let me speak for myself. If I look back at those sentences, I don't think those are proportionate to the crime they committed. And so he's been an advocate for the judges now have the ability to grant a retroactive parole for those people, and he's been an advocate to try to get that done. And so I've been working with him and other people that have been impacted by the system to try to find ways to build the credibility with the group of people that are necessary to have a good criminal justice system.
Thank you so much, Scott. So it seemed Anthony's having a bit of trouble joining on. He should be with us any moment. So I'd love to sort of, pick up where you just left off there. You mentioned that you thought that there were some laws that were, disproportionate or perhaps unduly harsh, and you sort of, have come to, to understand that now and learning with your community. How do you think prosecutors can work with their community to right, what you've seen as past wrongs of sentences that you would consider unduly or overly punitive?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that you have to do is something that I feel like, I'm kind of in the group of prosecutors that are reform minded. And so there are a lot of prosecutors that have been doing it for a long period of time, and they and their mindset on it, the way they were trained to be prosecutors, were not really to worry about the collateral consequences of incarceration, not really to worry about being necessarily proactive in preventing crime. They were trained to focus in on what their job was, which is to prosecute the crime, make a plea offer that you felt was reasonable. If the judge accepted it, great. If not, the judge didn't sentence it. They very narrow focus. And that was what I feel like they were trained as far as what safety meant for their communities. Whereas for me, I've kind of, I think in a lot of those older prosecutors, if you actually talk to them, because I had a lot of them that worked with me, and I'm active in my association, they would admit there's a lot of missed opportunities for that approach, because that approach is so narrow. One of the things you're not doing is you're not talking to the people that are being impacted by the crime, other than the victims when they come to you, right? And a lot of times over time, those victims became less and less willing to even cooperate with the system because they themselves didn't have a lot of faith in it. And so what I feel like is necessary is the first time you talk to a victim in a poor community can't be when they're the victim of a crime. That can't be the only time your office interacts with people in that community. You can't just leave that to the police, right? You've got to, as a district prosecutor, as a DA, you've got to go to those communities, have community forums. I mean, obviously now you're probably going to be doing Zoom more than anything, but find opportunities to interact with the communities that are actually dealing with the crime, and then what are their priorities about solving crime? Because one of the things I know about my police force, there'll be a spike in crime in a certain area, and the response to that will be, okay, what we're going to do is over patrol that area. We're going to increase patrol. But if you talk to the people that are in that community, that's not necessarily what they want. What they want is a different type of dynamic between them and the police. And so, there's a lot of things that you need to do. But as far as is correcting past wrong, I think what we got to do is just admit that sort of that traditional tough on crime approach, in my mind, it was too broad. We incarcerated too many people, particularly for nonviolent drug offenses, and it created a lot of collateral consequences that we need to try to correct. And we need to do what we can to try to minimize those collateral consequences going forward.
Thank you so much, Scott. And I just wanted to, touch on one of the points that you brought up, which is, listening to your community. So I know that your office has done quite a bit to sort of bring in as much community engagement as possible and hear from all the voices. So would you mind sort of just talking through some of the tools that you've used to really hear from your community, engage with them, and ensure that you're getting, all of the voices of your community's input, not just the loudest ones? Yeah,
sure. So, I mean, and I want to maybe let me describe my office for a little bit, because I've been in meetings with people from like Chicago or New York, and their offices are so big. They've got people just focused on community engagement, and my office is small. I've got 5 prosecutors, 2 investigators, 2 victim impact coordinators, and maybe 3 or 4 personnel staff. So a very, very small office. So also my community is small, so that creates some opportunities that maybe are more difficult in bigger areas. But so one of the first things that I feel like you have to do is have community meetings and town halls, whatever you want to call them, in the areas that are actually impacted by crime. You know, I guess the best way I can explain that, Michael, is a lot of times you'll have a small group of people that are very loud about what should be done to correct the criminal justice system, and quite often those people really aren't the victims of very much crime, right? You know, they have a lot of fear about crime for various reasons, but actual being victimized is not nearly as much as people that live in the proximity of people that are kind of what we call the repeat offenders. So you need to go to those areas. The thing that I did that also I feel like is important is you've got to, I have a directly impacted council where people that have gone to prison, you know, they're on the council with me. I meet with them once a month. We go over policies in my offices. We go over what's going on in the community, what we can do to be proactive. For example, you know, going to the youth courts, seeing what people are kind of, you know, there's problems created with those people where we may be able to be proactive. You know, listen to the 911 calls, right? I mean, how often, who are making 911 calls or what areas, and then trying to find ways to get to engage in those areas. Obviously, you can go to the high schools. I mean, I speak at my high schools all the time, you know. So those are just quite a. I see Anthony's got on, so I want to give an opportunity to hear from him. But those are just a few of the things that you can do. But obviously, you're going to talk to your victims. I mean, I've got people. I meet with victims all the time. That's the biggest group of people I meet with are victims. But you know, that can't be the only people you talk to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. It does look like Anthony's joined us, and Anthony, I'm so sorry about the mix-up in the audio problems, but you know, we sort of jumped into this conversation, but I'd love to now take a step back and you know, allow you to have an opportunity to sort of frame this conversation. You know, there's been a lot of conversation that we've had today about, you know, community safety and using intelligence-driven prosecution to ensure that. But I'd love if you would share a little bit with us about sort of what community safety means to you and how you see that.
Thank you for having me. Community safety means to me just that, keeping our people safe in the community. And in order to do that, we need to get out and interact more with our local law enforcement officials. Our local law enforcement officials, as well as prosecutors or any elected official, should continue to meet with people, not just during election time. You're going to have to meet with these people throughout your tenure in office. You're going to have to continue to do that. People are going to have to feel comfortable with talking to district attorneys, or whoever, trial judges. You need to have an open line for people in the community to get in contact with you and talk with you about certain issues that they may be faced with, problems that they may be faced with. One of the biggest things that people in the community have is not being able to get in contact with people once they're trying to, once a problem arises and they need to get in contact with somebody. A lot of people get discouraged when they're not able to communicate and talk with the person. And that could lead to a lot of hardship as far as hatred and stuff towards someone. So definitely, we definitely need to, people who are in office, they definitely need to be able to address the public, have a communication with the public, and just have an open line to people who are seeking help from them.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And sort of building off that, you know, we're talking a little bit about what the priorities of a district attorney's office are. How do you sort of see the community playing a part in setting what those priorities are? And how have you worked with Scott to, you know, do some of those things?
Yeah, well, the district attorney's responsibility, aside from prosecution, is also, like I said, to be able to talk to the people. You know, there are things that happen that people should be able to talk to a prosecutor on and try to work and resolve the issue out. And in a lot of cases, there are instances where people receive sentences that, you know, you have to be fair in your sentencing too, you know, as well as anything else. There are certain crimes we know that, you know, I mean, if you do certain things that, you know, it's little that they can do. But in other instances, you have to go back and you have to look at what was done, the person who did it, what caused them to do it, and things of that nature. And if we do that, I feel like everything in our community, as far as working with our prosecutors, you know, would be better.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Scott, jumping back to you, you know, one thing that I know that you've been pushing through your office and it's been, you know, pretty successful in the early stages is your engagement with restorative justice and disrupting cycles of trauma and community grief counseling. Can you share a little bit about sort of the ways you've worked with your community to build out those programs and sort of, you know, the early feedback you've gotten on those?
Yeah. Before I answer that, Michael, let me make a point that Anthony brought up, and I think it's important. Some of this, Michael, requires prosecutors to give up power, which is difficult. Because if we're being honest, a lot of what helps prosecutors when it comes to unsevere and unjust and severe sentencing is that gives you leverage to get someone to plea, right? If someone's facing 60 years mandatory for selling cocaine, you have a lot of leverage on them when it comes to saying whether they should go to trial or not. And that can be uncomfortable saying, I want to give up some of my leverage. But the reality is, if we're actually thinking about what's fair for our criminal justice system, what's best for the community, we have to give up some of that leverage because nobody should get 60 years mandatory for selling cocaine. It just should not happen. I mean, maybe if there's some big time trafficker and they're moving weights, you know, I mean, tons of cocaine across the border or some scenario like that. But if Anthony has a friend that sold a small crack rock of cocaine, third time doing it, he should not get 60 years mandatory as a result of it. And if that means that I lose some of my leverage in getting him to plea, that's just going to have to be what it's going to have to be. Because if our job is truly to do what's best for the criminal justice system, it's, you know, I often hear prosecutors, they'll say, Michael, I can't get witnesses. My witnesses won't cooperate. They won't do this. They won't do that. And it's not my fault. It's their fault, right? Well, if you actually ever went and talk to those people in the community about why they won't cooperate, a lot of them have no faith in the system. They feel like it's an unfair system that's targeting their community. And if we look at historical practices, in a lot of ways, there was targeting. I mean, you know, it's kind of cliche to say, but we had a totally different reaction to the crack epidemic than we had to the opioid epidemic. Totally different. And people know that. They can see that. And so so I think it's important. We have to acknowledge that sometimes we have to give up a little bit of our leverage when it comes to pleading. But as far as restorative justice goes, you know, what I learned in the 5 years I've been doing this is a lot of times victims don't ever feel like they get the opportunity to explain to the person that harmed them the effects of that, right? What happens is somebody gets arrested and it immediately becomes an adversarial system, and, you know, there's very little communication between the people. It's just totally discouraged. And, you know, at some point, most of the time, 9 out of 10 times, there's a plea deal with a person admits guilt just to get less punishment for whatever reason, and the victim gets to say maybe 30 seconds of how they felt, and it's over, right? Well, if you talk to enough victims, particularly of when they really feel traumatized, that's not fulfilling to them. And it also doesn't give the person that caused the harm really any acknowledgement of the harm they caused. What they're really doing is they're just looking out for their own self-interest. They're just pleading to get less punishment. There's no acknowledgement of harm. There's no, I mean, you know, there's no of facing what was actually done. And so what I found is I learned about restorative justice a couple of years ago, and I found that Michael's been very, very powerful in bringing parties together. You can't do it in every case. You know, you got to start off small, maybe your auto burglaries, home burglaries. You know, if your office handles misdemeanors, you can do it more often with misdemeanors. Certainly, if you got youth court, it can be a powerful tool in youth court. If your office handles youth court, you know, if your office doesn't handle youth court, encourage your youth court to get involved in restorative justice, because we have to get people to acknowledge the trauma and harm of violence and crime. Because until that's acknowledged, it's very difficult to get the person that caused the harm to take the step towards rehabilitation, and also the person that is harmed, then, you know, a lot of times, unfortunately, they become a person that causes harm themselves. I mean, I can tell you about a case where, you know, guy's brother was murdered, you know, and then later on, but a year later, he murdered somebody else. And I don't know if there's a connection, that may be totally random, but there's some, you know, there's certainly a coincidence there that's worth noting.
Thank you so much, Scott. And you know, before we take a couple questions, you know, the last thing that I'd like to put to Anthony, and then Scott, give you an opportunity to chime in after, is this morning we heard a bit about, you know, using sort of crime strategy to disrupt cycles and patterns of violence. And I think it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't have a conversation about the role that a community can play in, you know, crime prevention. Anthony, do you have any sort of thoughts on the best way for you know, DAs to engage with their communities in preventing violence and disrupting cycles of trauma in the first place?
Yes, one of the first things that is leading to a lot of crime in different communities is drug abuse. You have a high number of communities, especially African Americans. It's all over, but it's more in African American communities, that people are less inclined to get involved with prosecutors. If a person come around from, say he's a police officer or something like that, it's kind of hard for him to come into an area that's infested with narcotics and talk to people. We've got to figure out a way to hold community meetings with these people in the community and get them to understand that prosecutors are not just there to prosecute, they're there to help as well. And once we figure that out, then I feel like the cycle that has been continued for the last 30, 40 years will stop. But right now we have a lot of people who are addicts who are receiving life sentences and 60-year mandatory sentences. When that happens for a small petty crime, I mean, nobody wins. And you know, it's just something that we're going to have to try to figure out. As a prison reform advocate, I've seen a lot of different cases where people just don't know how to come forward and talk to people, you know, because that's just the mentality, so to speak, a lot of people have about dealing with law enforcement officials.
5-minute warning.
We're definitely going to have to do something in order to make that start coming together.
Thank you so much. And DA Colom, you know, giving you an opportunity to jump in here. Any ways that you've sort of found success working with your community and, you know, disrupting violence and cycles of trauma?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, disrupting cycles of violence, I mean, it's very, very difficult because you know, really at a certain point when you're talking about gun violence, you know, once they get to a certain age, it gets harder to disrupt it unless you have people with credibility having those conversations with them. I mean, me and Scott Colom as prosecutor, DA, I mean, my community is small, they kind of know my background. They're not related to me in the same way that they're going to relate to Anthony Swift. So, I mean, Anthony Swift can have credibility with them as far as, listen, you think that these decisions don't have consequences? Let me tell you about the consequences that I've seen it have to other people, seen it have for myself. So the first thing I would tell you, you have to find people that have been impacted and let some of those be the voices for intervention. And that's what I've tried to do. You know, like Anthony, he'll call me all the time, telling me stuff I need to be doing, cases I need to help get resolved. I mean, he's talking about, when he's referring to these 60-year sentences, we've got some sentences that were really severe. And so what can we do to prevent that? And if you get that credibility with people, then they'll go and speak on your behalf with some of the young people that are involved in it. Now, but the other thing you got to do is you got to start younger. You got to be young. If you're not involved with your youth court, if you're not involved with your schools, because the teachers, the youth court administrators, they know where the problems are coming. And you've got to be in communication with them and try to intervene in that area. And that's some place where I don't have jurisdiction over youth court. So that's something that I've been having to do partnerships with the different youth court jurisdictions, because there's a lot of research that shows I mean, once they get to the point where they get older, the returns on intervention get tougher and tougher.
Thank you so much. And the final question I'd like to put to both of you is cultivating legitimacy. I know in 2020 we're obviously having a deep conversation of the history of racial injustice in this country, in particular with law enforcement. So where do we go from here, right? The answer isn't we just throw up our hands and call it quits, but how do you build that legitimacy with your community and ensure that they have faith in the system and the process?
Well, I'll be quick and then I'll let Anthony get to the final word. I think one, we have to acknowledge the harm that the system caused. I mean, it's not personal. The harm was never personal. I mean, it just, we have to acknowledge the harm, and then two, we've got to commit to reform. What we're going to do differently. And we have to listen to all voices. We can't just listen to the voices that, make us comfortable. We have to be able to listen to the voices that challenge us and that challenge the status quo. That would be my quick answer.
Thank you, D.A. Colom. And Anthony?
Yeah, well, when you're dealing with legitimacy, we just have to go back to the very beginning. Here in Mississippi, when they passed the bill that authorized that people get a whole lot of time, they came back a few years later and they redid it. Right now, we have about 4 people in Clay County Circuit Court who are eligible for parole who receive harsh sentences. One of the ways to get back to the community and show the people that our local law enforcement officials and judges are willing to work with them is by some of the things that's about to take place. Hearings, bringing these people back who've received these life sentences for $10 worth of drugs. And these people were nothing more than common addicts when the crime was committed. Bringing these people back to court, getting these people placed on some type of parole. I have a guy who will be brought back to Clay County Circuit Court tomorrow who had received a 60-year mandatory sentence. It was unfair because the same judge that gave this guy a 60-year mandatory sentence, he's Black, gave a white guy right behind him with more charges 5 years after he was found guilty on the jury trial. So that's something that we're going to have to correct. We're going to have to correct that because as it stands right now, our African-American community feel like whites have received far less sentences than our African-American counterparts, which is true. You can go to the courthouse like I do, and you can look in the files and you can see it, the sentencing disparities. We got to correct that. If we start bringing these guys back to court who received these sentences in 89 and 90, and then start granting them some type of relief, then the people will feel more inclined to start communicating with our local law enforcement officials. They'll feel comfortable that, hey, they were fair. They had gave him or her this, and they brought them back, and they corrected that. So those are some of the things that really needs to happen in order for our community to start receiving some type of transparency.
Thank you both so much. That's all the time we had. Thank you to our panelists. This was a really wonderful conversation. We're now going to go back into our breakout groups for 45 minutes. And I'd love to encourage anyone who is able to turn on your video, get ready to participate. And thank you all so much for this amazing conversation.